All right, ladies, in class today, we had just left off on the note introducing the Mayflower Compact, and we will kind of pick up with that activity in class on Monday. So for now, we're just going to kind of continue in the notes, and so if you have your Chapter 2 outlines open, we're going to address a few more things about the Separatists or the Pilgrims. They are going to settle within Massachusetts, specifically in the Plymouth colony. The Massachusetts colony was initially divided in half. We'll talk about that later, but the Separatists or the Pilgrims are first settling in the Plymouth colony. Not like Plymouth Rock, because there is no Plymouth Rock, and I'm sorry to bust your bubble on that. There's no evidence in any sort of writings by the Pilgrims that they landed on a specific rock. But they will settle, and they will go on to establish a thriving colony. They do celebrate the first Thanksgiving with Native Americans, so that is a legitimate tale, although it's not called Thanksgiving at the time. I think President Lincoln's the one to establish it as an official holiday, so several years later. But they do go on to have a wonderful colony. They will have a representative government, and they will actually have a separation of church and state within their colony, where they allow people who live within their colony to practice any religion that they would choose. So now we're going to go on to talk about the other group that we briefly introduced in class that wanted to kind of clean up the Anglican Church from within, the Puritans. While they're not quite as dramatic in what they want to do to the Anglican Church, they're still not really liked back home in England. So they too are going to eventually have to flee to kind of create their own establishment where they can practice their faith freely. And the leader of the Puritans, his name is John Winthrop. And just a quote by him, "We must consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill." This is referencing how the Puritans view themselves. And if you think about a city on top of a hill, that means everyone kind of looks up to the city and looks up to the city as setting an example for the rest of society. And that's how John Winthrop thinks the Puritans need to live. Basically a very moral life, and a life where they're setting an example onto others. Remind me, by the way, later to show you some funny Puritan valentines. So the Puritans are going to settle also in Massachusetts, but specifically the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And they also create a representative government, just like the Separatists. But the biggest difference is that the Puritans are going to establish a theocracy, okay, as in theology, but theocracy. And this does mean that their government is going to be based on the Puritan faith and religion. So they are not going to have a separation of church and state, and they are not going to allow people to practice the religion of their choice. And in fact, the laws will be reflective of the Puritan religion. So they're going to be very, very conservative with their laws, and everything that the Puritans did was to be for God and not for any sort of pleasure or enjoyment. So it's not really a pleasant lifestyle, or a pleasurable lifestyle, I should say, or a fun lifestyle. If you're familiar with the book, which you may become this year, The Scarlet Letter. The Scarlet Letter is set in Puritan New England. So not very harsh rules and punishments, okay? And, the church was also kind of in charge of was the authority figure in the colony, and if you were on the colonial assembly, you were also a church member, and you paid taxes to the church, and it was just all about the church. Now, if anyone challenged their ideas, they would get in some trouble. A few examples of this, people who were kind of naughty within this Massachusetts Bay colony. Roger Williams. He actually was a scholar who taught against theocracy, said that, there should be a separation of church and state, and that's not going to win him any points in the leadership, and so he is going to be banished from the colony. And he actually goes on to find his own colony and kind of lead his own settlement a little bit south of Massachusetts Bay, and that is the colony of Rhode Island. So that's how Rhode Island actually came to exist. It was Roger Williams' kind of banished land away from Massachusetts Bay. A woman named Anne Hutchinson was also exiled. They believed that she was a heretic. She spoke out against the church's disapproval of women in leadership. She tried to kind of stand up for women and said that women should be able to take a leadership role, and that was just not thought of as acceptable to the church, and so they will chase her away as well, and so she will also be banished to join Roger Williams in Rhode Island. And then the probably most notable example is going to take place within Salem, Massachusetts. And this does reference, if you're familiar with your history, the Salem witch trials. So, essentially, a little background, several young girls were kind of having these seizure-like episodes, and no doctor could really explain what was happening. They probably didn't have a diagnosis for epilepsy just yet. And the girls then went on to say, well, if we can't just, explain it medically, then it must be witchcraft. And people just kind of went on this mass rampage of accusing different people in town of being witches and casting spells on them. And it essentially just creates this idea of mass hysteria and this mob mentality of you're afraid to get targeted, so you point the blame on someone else, and you don't want to get accused of being a witch, so you're going to accuse someone else, and you were supposed to be able to, you needed to confess for your sins, but if you didn't want to, because you didn't do anything wrong, you would be hanged anyway. And so it was just this kind of crazy incident, and there's a play all about it called The Crucible, which you also may become familiar with this semester in English. And in the end of it, there was all kinds of accusations. 19 people were hanged, and almost 200 people were jailed. So it did kind of get crazy for a while. Okay, we're going to talk about a few more colonies today getting established, and then we're going to stop and save the rest for class on Monday. So, just like Charles I, Charles II is also going to be giving away large amounts of land in effort to pay off debt. Charles is going to give his brother, James, the Duke of York, territory that he acquired from the Netherlands. Remember, we talked about the fact that the Netherlands had territory in present-day New York, but they were never able to defend it, and so this means that it's going to get swallowed up by England pretty quickly. So James, the Duke of York, is given the territory that will make up the colony of New York, and he names it New York after himself. New Jersey was also given to, I think, a couple of members of the aristocracy in England. You don't need to know any names or anything like that, but just know, just like New York, New Jersey was given away as a means to pay off debt. And so were the Carolinas. The Carolinas were also given away just south of Virginia to different aristocrats in English society who Charles owed money to. But I just kind of wanted to point out the fact that there were two different settlements, and North and South Carolina did look very different at this point in history. Honestly, North Carolina kind of became an overflow of people from Virginia, meaning like as Virginia continued to thrive and get very populated, people who wanted more space would move south into North Carolina, again, south of Virginia, into North Carolina, because North Carolina is south of Virginia. All those terms kind of get confusing. North Carolina kind of became poorer families who just couldn't afford to live in Virginia anymore, while South Carolina became a settlement for wealthier settlers. And we're going to see South Carolina really get into certain crops that were very laborsome, and so they're going to be really importing or purchasing a lot of African slaves to be shipped into South Carolina, and we'll look at that later. And the last thing we'll talk about is the colony of Pennsylvania. Charles II gave William Penn the land that made up Pennsylvania to pay off a debt as well. So pretty much all these places we've covered are just paying debts that this family owes. Now, William Penn was a Quaker. Quakers were a type of political institution that who were pacifists, meaning they would refuse to fight in any sort of wars because they didn't believe in that level of violence. And because of that, the Quakers are not very liked in England, obviously, because they don't always support the British military ventures. And so William Penn's going to kind of make the Pennsylvania colony a safe haven for Catholics. I'm sorry, not for Catholics, for Quakers. And you're going to have a large Quaker population living there. And so we will call Pennsylvania after William Penn. And yes, he does look just like the man on the Quaker oatmeal container. And I'll let you just ponder that for the rest of your weekend. And please write down any questions you may have, and we'll go over that on Monday. And I hope you'll have a good weekend, and I will see you Monday.